Alright, so today we're going to be going over the nuts and bolts of critical reasoning. We're going to start out by looking at the author's concepts and arguments. The four things that he talks about are claims, issues, arguments, and fallacies. So first we're going to go over claims. So claims are, a claim is a statement that asserts something to be the case or not be the case. A lot of times these are opinions. It's not a claim if it's a question, exclamation, command, request, phrase, or posed in ceremonial language. This can be changed, however. Things that are posed in these different forms can be changed and turned into an actual claim. An issue is whether something needs a yes or a no, or it's right or wrong. So that is what you are answering with your claim. That is what you're answering it with your conclusion. So, and then your argument is whenever you bring all this together in this format that we see here on the side. And then these two on the bottom, these are the two different conclusions that you can come to with different sets of premises. So, argument uses this basic structure. Premises offer support and evidence for the conclusion. And like I mentioned, this down here would be the conclusion, and then up here we have the premises for each of the conclusions. Next we have fallacies. There are a lot of fallacies. I'm just going to run through. I'm going to mention every one of them and just a little bit about them, and then we'll move on. So fallacies create bad arguments, leading to a conclusion that we shouldn't accept. Emotional fallacies. I feel X, therefore Y is true. There are lots of different emotional fallacies. This is just kind of the basic structure of an emotional fallacy. So that's what I'm going to talk about when it comes to them for the moment. Popularity fallacy. Many people believe X is true, therefore X is true. Again, there's other popularity fallacies, but that's the only one that I'm going to mention right now. Two wrongs don't make a right. Someone else did X, therefore X is right. Red herring, using claims unrelated to the conclusion to sway the audience in your favor. Smokescreen tends to pile issues on or make them extremely complicated until the original gets lost in the smoke. Personal attack ad hominem, discredit the person, discredits the claim. So this personal attack would be where you first discredit the person with the claim, and then therefore you've discredited the claim, or so you believe. Inconsistency attack ad hominem, which is where the person's claim is inconsistent with something about that person, so they couldn't really be making that claim, so therefore the claim must be false. Again, like, just because maybe they're associated with a certain organization and their personal beliefs don't coincide with that, it does not, it shouldn't discredit their claims just because they're associated with an organization who has different claims. Poison the well. Attacking the person with things that are so devastating to character that it's very difficult to recover. So attacking someone for past comments or past actions, true or false, so that it discredits them as a person and therefore would discredit their claim. Genetic fallacy, discredit the source, discredit the claim. So you would be discrediting either maybe an organization or a person because of where they are, where they come from. Maybe it's a person and you're discrediting them because of the field that they're from. So maybe someone is trying to make a biological breakthrough, but they aren't in biology. So you could discredit their claim using the genetic fallacy, which isn't honest. But that's what a genetic fallacy would be. It's where you discredit the claim by discrediting the origin of the claim, which would be inconsistent with what the claim is and where it came from. Straw man, attacking the argument to strengthen your position. Would be distorting, oversimplifying, or falsifying the other argument to make yours stronger. And then we have false dilemma, steering towards the desired response by limiting the options to two extremes. If you're not for this, you're for that. So it's limiting someone to two extreme opposite claims and not giving them anything in between, anything on a spectrum. Slippery slope. This can be a very valid argument and logical argument structure. It basically says if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then D, and then if A, then D. So if all that is true, then if you have A, then you will have D. This can be a logical argument, but each premises has to be 100% true. If you find one weak point, then the whole thing is false and is a bad argument. So you'd want to look very closely at those. If you're planning on using something like that, you need to look very closely at it and make sure no one can knock you down. But it is still a valid argument structure, and you can still use it. You just have to be very careful with it. And of course, there's all these different A, B, C, D. So you have to be careful with which ones you use, and make sure that they are true. Perfectionist fallacy. If the policy acts will not meet our goals as well as we like, perfect, they should be rejected. So this would be saying that if something isn't going to turn out 100% perfect, then we should just not try it, which is the perfectionist fallacy. Misplacing the burden of proof, appeal to ignorance. You haven't proven X to be the case, burden of proof is on you, therefore X is the case. Begging the question, rewording to say the same thing, P, therefore P. So a lot of religious, and Dr. Sadler brought this up, a lot of religious scholars will bring up the argument, or theologians will say, God exists because the Bible says so. Well, how do we know the Bible is true? Because God said it is. So it's a circular argument, which is a huge fallacy. So that's basically all of that. So what ideas were new to me? I have studied a lot of ethics and philosophy and critical thinking without knowing it, but so some of the language was new. I hadn't formally studied it before, so a lot of the language is new. Most all the fallacies, just the details of each of them were very new to me. Stuff I hadn't been taught before. Again, fallacies, the proper names and criteria. I just hadn't been introduced to them in that way before. I have seen them over and over again, and I've heard lots about them, certain ones, but not all of them. So like straw man, I've heard a lot about straw man, but I haven't actually studied it and gotten to know exactly what it is. I just know I've seen it before. And also the structure of a proper argument. I have never been given the structure of a proper argument, which is really wonderful, and I think can help anyone in any walk of life, whether in your personal or professional life, knowing the correct way to go about an argument and to get your point across in a fair manner. So those three things were very new to me, and I'm really glad I know them now. What new questions did this content bring up for you? What did it make you curious about? So one of the things was how, why, when do I use fallacies to half-ass an argument or avoid someone else's claims? So I am curious about when I use fallacies and how I can point those out to myself and be more aware of when I do and to stop myself whenever I'm about to use a fallacy or use a fallacy on someone else. I've already begun to implement critical thinking in my life and have thought about it long before I knew the nuts and bolts, but I'm curious as to how long it would take to become second nature. Do you ever get to the point where you don't have to consciously step back and use critical reasoning? So um, I'm very curious as to, yeah, how long it would take, if it's possible, to just use critical reasoning and critical thinking all the time without having to critically think about it. So when does it become second nature? And if it even can become second nature, like, uh, fallacies are, because fallacies can be very, very second nature. They can be right on the tip of your tongue. So I wonder if this critical reasoning can get to that point, and I'd love to get there. So, and I'm sure if it does, it takes lots of practice, and so I think that's what I'm going to work on now. Regardless if it's possible or not, just practicing it, I think, will get me somewhere. Did this content in any way change the way you think about the world, and if so, how? Does the majority of the population even care about critical thinking, or are they content without it? So this is like, do other people, does the majority of the population, do they actually want to use critical reasoning in their everyday life, or um, do they just not care? Are they just too busy to slow down and think about it, or do they just not care when they rather sit in front of the TV and watch a talk show? Just curious about that, you know? It's made me kind of think about that, and think about individuals and how much critical reasoning they tend to use in their daily lives, and especially the people around me. Like, I look at certain people and I can tell that there are certain people who use critical reasoning a lot more than others, and I've noticed that those people are a lot more fun to be around, and the conversations are much more stimulating. The second one was, what does critical thinking throughout the years within the general public look like? How much does it fluctuate? So, through the ages, has it fluctuated? Has the general public been more apt to use critical reasoning and critical thinking, throughout the centuries? Has there been a time where it was very high or very low? Did it coincide with the Dark Ages? I'd like to kind of look at that some more. What are some ways you could use the ideas if you don't agree? So, as far as myself, I tend to agree with everything that he had to say. Um, there may be a few things that I was kind of iffy on, maybe like because of some of the things I've heard in the past, but nothing big enough that I would discredit him. And of course, that would be a fallacy, so wouldn't do that. But if you do disagree, some things to keep in mind were to be more careful with your own arguments. So even if you disagreed with maybe some of his fallacies and the criteria that he had for them, after listening to it, you can still take from that and say and recognize to be more careful with your arguments, to realize that other people are looking at your arguments more critically now, and you need to be more careful with them. Even if you don't believe in the fallacies, you can surely see them as a weakened argument. So, again, if you don't agree with the fallacies and the criteria, you could still use that criteria to recognize a weak argument, even if you don't think it's a bad argument. So I think those are two things that you could still take away from this concept. What connections, if any, are there between the ideas you consumed and the ones you already knew? So, as I said before, I study a lot of ethical and philosophical content in my free time. So, making the connection between terms I hear about and structural flaws that are pointed out is really great. So, just making those connections, because I've heard these terms and I've seen them played out over and over in debates. I mean, I've watched hours and hours of debates each week, and now being able to, I know I'll be able to recognize the fallacies whenever they come up, and pinpoint where they went wrong, where the arguments went wrong, where the argument went bad. And I really appreciate that, and I look forward to using it in my everyday life. And thank you.